Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CLC Lecture Series. My name is Guru and I'm from the Center for Liveable Cities. The Center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC Lecture Series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. In today's session, we are honored to have with us Mr. Bernard Harrison, Principal Partner of Bernard Harrison and Friends Ltd, who is also the founder and creator of Singapore's Zoological Gardens and the world's first night safari. Mr. Harrison will share interesting insights from his 29 years spent setting up and managing Singapore's first animal attractions and his thoughts on how Singapore can be more creative in various sectors. Today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Mr. Harrison, followed by a panel discussion and a question and answer session with the audience, which will be moderated by Ms. Yeoh Siew Hoon, the founder and editor of Web in Travel, which is Asia Pacific's leading content and community portal for professionals passionate about travel marketing, distribution, and technology. With this, let us start the session by inviting Mr. Harrison on stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be invited here to this beautiful city that I am so familiar with. I used to live here for 40 years, I guess, something like that, 40 years. Now my wife and I, Tina and myself, we live in Sanur in Bali, and no need to ask why we moved there. We also have a house in Penang as well. Well, this talk is designed to try and split the audience down the middle. So half of you hopefully will end up hating me, and the other half will love me. So it's controversial. Okay. Creating world-class tourist attractions out of humble products. Singapore, the new Serengeti. Possibly. So what's this talk all about? Well, we do have a lot of gall because we are actually promoting ourselves as a Serengeti. Our nature-based attractions. Evolution, then I'll talk a little bit about evolution in zoos. And then setting up the night safari, which I think is the guts of what I'm trying to get across to you. And then I'll start splitting the audience in two by talking about Singapore's system stifles creativity, that in fact we're not a creative society at all, and then talk about how we can generate new ideas and implement change in Singapore. And hopefully that'll take about 45 minutes. But actually, do we have a lot of gall? This is Tanzania. The Serengeti National Park is 14,700 square kilometers in size, and it is 4.4% of the land size of Tanzania. This is Singapore. We have national parks, 31.8 square kilometers in size, which is actually 4.48% of our total land area. So in fact, we do have more percentage under national park than Tanzania. We have Samba. We had tigers. The last tiger was shot in 1932, but the Sultan of Johor, the old one, used to tell me that he would sit on his balcony at the Polo Club in JB and watch tigers swim across the straits to Singapore quite regularly. We had elephants until quite recently. We had 3 swim across from Malaysia to Pulau Tekong in 1990. And then we had another 2 swim across to Ubin in 1991. And they can swim. They use their trunks as a sort of a snorkel. It took us to bring the Malaysian elephant capture team down from Malaysia to help us to transport them back to Malaysia by barge. And then we got into a problem with the CITES because the CITES authority said that we were illegally sending animals, endangered animals, back to Malaysia. But thus is bureaucracy. We used to have clouded leopards in Singapore until about 70 or 80 years ago. We have, I'm told by one of the otter experts here, that we have actually quite a lot of smooth otters back in Singapore. And we have now about 40 banded leaf monkeys. There are actually 4 gazetted national parks in Singapore. The Central Catchment Nature Reserve, which is 2,800 hectares. The Old Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, which is the first one, 164 hectares. Sungai Buloh, which is 130, and Labrador Nature Reserve, which is 10 hectares. We also actually have a lot of other nature-based attractions. We have Wildlife Reserve Singapore, which is a holding company for the Singapore Zoo, Night Safari, Jurong Bird Park, and the River Safari, which just recently opened. It has a total of 1,500 species, of which 500 are fish, and an annual attendance of about 4.3 million, and a net profit after tax of about $18 million. Of those, Singapore Zoo is ranked one of the top 10 zoos in the world. It was opened in 1973, and it has about 1.8 million visitors annually. It uses nature as a benchmark, and is still one of the most beautiful zoos in the world, I think. The Night Safari, which I was particularly involved in setting up, has about 1 million visitors a year, opened 1994. It's a multi-award-winning attraction, as is the zoo, but the Night Safari has more international accolades, and it is the first, and I can assure you it's the best in the world, because we have designed the others. And it's not so much about design, it's about maintenance. And I think Singapore is very good at maintenance. Anyway, it's a beautiful park. The Jurong Bird Park has about 1 million visitors a year. Opened in 1971, it was the first. It was actually mooted by Dr. Goh Quing Swee. It has the largest collection of birds in the world, 650 species. In my opinion, probably a little too many, but anyway, that was my opinion. It has a beautiful penguin exhibit and fantastic animal bird shows. This is a falcon, but one of my favorite is actually when a griffin's vulture, which has a wingspan of about 2 meters, flies down to the presenters. The River Safari is based on the great rivers of the world, mainly because you can't put salt water in the middle of the Upper Seletar Reservoir, otherwise the PUB would go nutty. It has about 600,000 visitors. Probably will do better in the next couple of years. Opened last year, and it has about 500 species of animals. And one of the great tanks is the Mekong catfish. Strangely enough, Singapore decided to open 2 large aquariums simultaneously. Marine Life Park, or this SEA Aquarium at Resorts World, was until I think 2 months ago the largest aquarium in the world. The director told me that it had just been surpassed by a Chinese aquarium, and shortly the one in Guangzhou, which is run by Chimelong, will actually be the largest. But it's a beautiful aquarium, has a very, very beautiful tank, and is well worth seeing. We also have the very established Singapore Botanical Gardens, the Hort Park, and which is also a very interesting place. We have this mentality about tried and tested. I was talking about that this morning at the tourist board where I was giving a talk earlier. Singapore, we just need, our civil servants especially, really need to have things which have been done in other places. So Changi Airport was based on Schiphol. The MRT was based on the MTR in Hong Kong. And so when it came to our Gardens by the Bay, we based it on the Eden Project. Eden Project is beautiful. It's in Cornwall in the UK. It cost about £130 million, and it was a millennium project for the UK in 2000. Gardens by the Bay, in contrast, cost about $1.1 billion. Probably more likely, it cost about $1.6 billion, and I really do guess it cost about $2 billion. I think it's a very expensive attraction, but anyway, it is, to me, more architectural than it is botanical. But we have this wonderful thing called biophilia, and this is an instinctive bonding between humans and other living systems. This is Khoo Teck Puat Hospital, my favorite hospital in Singapore. If you haven't been to Khoo Teck Puat, just go there to visit it. It's got a huge, almost rainforest in the central atrium, and it is run by a good friend of mine who is, shall we say, a rebel in the civil service. The evolution of zoos, I think it's important to understand that a little. There are three basic operating models of zoos: society or non-profit, public or municipal, and private commercial. The society non-profit, of which Wildlife Conservation Society at the New York, formerly the New York Zoological Society, is the most important. Education, conservation, and research are the key tenets of a society-based zoo, and they do generate most of their own money. Wildlife reserves basically is a society or non-profit making organization. Although it does make a profit, it doesn't give it to shareholders, it plows the money back into the organization. This is opposed to public or government-operated zoos, which mostly suffer from a perpetual lack of funding. The best government zoo is the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and it's probably the best because it sits right in Washington and is funded by Congress. The third is the private or commercial operated zoo, and they tend to be able to reinvent themselves quickly to changing environments, but of course they are subordinate to shareholder value. And Disney's Animal Kingdom, which opened in 1999, is a very good example of such a zoo, which actually cost $1 billion to build and had a return of investment in 4 years. I'm going to take you through paradigm shifts because I think it's very important to understand when we get to the night safari what actually it's all about. There's been a number of paradigm shifts over the last 100 years in the zoo world. The first was in Hamburg in 1907, where a guy called Hagenbeck developed the first moated zoo in the world, where he replaced moats, he replaced bars and fences with moats. The second paradigm shift came in the west coast of California and San Diego, where SeaWorld opened in 1964, and there they took fish out of the fish house and put them outside and had dolphins and killer whales and things like that. So, and this was set up by a bunch of business people. Hagenbeck Zoo was set up by him, an animal dealer. The third was the Lion Safari Parks, of which a guy called Jimmy Chipperfield, who was a circus owner, set up, where he put the people into the cage, the car, and ran them through an enclosure of lions, and sometimes they had many problems if you forget to lock up your bonnet. The next paradigm shift was the environmentalists, where a guy called David Hancox, who actually I do still work with, who was the director at the time of the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, brought in landscape architects instead of architects to design animal environments. Initially, this is how we used to display Indian rhino. This is actually Philadelphia Zoo, 1962. Pretty miserable. This is how they're meant to be, because this is them in the wild in Kaziranga National Park. And this is how they look in the night safari. So the fifth paradigm shift was the night safari in Singapore, which opened in 1994, and it displayed nocturnal animals when they are active, which is at night. And 90% of all mammals in the world, in the tropics, are nocturnal. The last paradigm shift of the last 100 years was Disney's Animal Kingdom. And It opened in 1999, and it is obviously a very good reproduction of going to the wild. Now, why do paradigms shift? And why don't zoo directors shift paradigms? Well, basically, paradigm shifts come mainly from outsiders to the industry, as you've seen from these paradigm shifts. And they're on a personal journey. Circumstances normally dictate innovation, and they're forced to take a risk or grasp an opportunity because they see it, they're outsiders, they see it once and they say, I've got to do that, otherwise it will never come again. Most zoo directors, on the other hand, are scientists and they're salaried. And the businessmen who do come in and become CEOs of zoos are normally beholden to their curators, which means that they're scared to do anything with the animals because the curators will tell them, you can't do that. Some zoo directors come up with smaller innovations, but never the real quantum leaps, like these paradigm shifts. And basically you have to just start from scratch. So Hagenbeck, what did he have? Hagenbeck, the German who set up the Hamburg Zoo, he had personal wealth, he had reinforced concrete, which has just come in, he had expertise in animal husbandry, and he was on a personal journey to make a name for himself, and that's why actually he set up that zoo in Hamburg. The SeaWorld had commercial money. There was 4 businessmen who decided to set up SeaWorld. They had a fantastic location. It was tropical, and it was in the US tourism belt. And they had new water treatment techniques that had come through, and they also had acrylic, which had come out of the war. And so they could do these new displaying techniques. Chipperfield, the guy who set up the safari parks, he had access to private cars because after the war, a lot of people were driving. He had plenty of lions because he was a circus guy, and he had chain link fences, which he pitched up around parks to get the cars to drive through. The first one, which is is the night safari, the first paradigm shift, which is a non-commercial person, was from Singapore. Basically, we just had the right timing. We saw the idea, and the tourist board had set up a $1 billion fund, as Pamelia was nodding, to promote tourism infrastructure, and we managed to tap in onto that. Singapore is also the first developed tropical country to have a zoo which thought about putting animals on display at night. We have regular sunset times, which makes it easy for operations, and we have pleasant and long nights. Animal Kingdom, in Disney's Animal Kingdom, had the world's largest commercial entertainment company. And they used the strategic opportunity of bundling their products with Disney World, with Epcot, and with MGM Studios. So, what happened with the night safari? Let me tell you a little bit about that story. I was talking to a friend of mine in Dubai, and I said, Riza, he's the director of the Dubai Zoo, and I said, Riza, what time do you open? He said, 9 o'clock. And I said, what time do you close? He said, 5 o'clock. And I said, what time do the people come? He said, 4 o'clock. So I said, why don't you close a bit later? He said, because we work from 9 to 5. And unfortunately, this is an accepted paradigm around the world. People open from 9 to 5. And even when we started talking about the night safari, a lot of my staff said, but you mean we have to work at night? Why a night safari? Basically, to display nocturnal animals at night. And as I said, 90% of all tropical mammals are nocturnal. And so actually, it's to display them when they are active.
The Fishing Cat Trail is named after members of the cat family. Fishing cats, as their name suggests, are well known for their amazing speed and skill in catching fish straight out of the water. The fishing cat is often seen prowling by the edge of the water for fish. Once its prey is spotted, the fishing cat, with its lightning-fast reflexes, dives its head into the water and snaps up the unsuspecting fish using its teeth and front paws.
So basically from nightfall, when you start, until midnight, displayed animals in a natural outdoor setting. There were many charismatic megavertebrates spend their days asleep, and that's because they're tropical mammals and they're nocturnal. Most birds are diurnal, and this has frustrated zoo directors for years in temperate countries. And so the National Zoo in Washington first started experiments with reversing day-night cycles in the 1940s to create a nocturnal house. And the thing about having a nocturnal house is that you've got to change the circadian rhythm of the animals that you are displaying. And you have to do this by convincing the animal that there is a substantial difference in the illumination. Now, for instance, outside, the daylight is about 100,000 lux, and at night it's about 1 lux. So you have to convince the animal that there's a substantial difference in that lighting intensity. The other problem with nocturnal houses is you can't display large animals because of this lighting issue. Vegetation is difficult to display, and animals don't have access to sunlight, which is detrimental for some of them, and they're maintained in small holding areas. So what happened? We started to develop the night safari one day when I got a call from the Public Utilities Board, and they said, Bernard, what are you going to do with that other 60 hectares of land that you have at the zoo? And I said, we've got plans. And they said, well, can you send us a report? And I said, of course we can, no problem. And I quickly called Dr. Ong, who was my chairman, and I said, we need to send the PUB a report. And so we started having many, many lunches with captains of industry, trying to figure out what to do with the 60 hectares of land. And we had all sorts of very interesting things. But eventually, it was Lindy Alwis, this gentleman here, who came up with the idea, why don't we create an extension to the zoo and put on a nocturnal area very similar to tiger tops in Chitwan National Park in Nepal, where basically they used to take a live goat and tie it to a peg, and tigers would come in, kill the goat. It was watched by many people. Nowadays they don't do that because of animal welfare issues, but that was the concept that he was developing. And Dr. Ong, who was a very sharp man, and actually an entrepreneur by entrepreneurial standards, said to Lin, has this ever been done before in a zoo? And Lin said, no, it's never been done. And he took a very un-Singaporean decision. He said, in that case, let's do it. Most Singaporean civil servants would say, oh, Jesus, where's the benchmarking? But Dr. Ong was not so civil service. In fact, he was very anti-civil service. So what's the essence? The essence was to bring people in at night when the animal's active, because Singapore nights are cool and pleasant, and simulate moonlight with illuminated exhibits. Lin's idea was to take people around in jeeps and really create the feeling of being in a national park. We did a lot of modeling. We created a master plan, and we looked at financial capacities and viability, and we said it's not going to work. So we changed the concept, and we created a more managed experience. We themed it like going to a national park, but actually it was basically a zoo run at night. So we could increase our capacity from 500 people a night to actually now it is about 8,000 to 9,000 people a night who can actually move through. And we paid a lot of attention to design and lighting and an orchestrated experience. Now, the single reason why so many great ideas around the world don't fly is because of insufficient financing, and that's really quite a problem. We took it to the to cabinet. We gave a proposal to cabinet for a project for $54 million, and it took cabinet 2 years, actually more than 2 years, to approve it. And every time, like every 3 months, Dr. Ong would call cabinet secretary and say, so how is it? And he would say, you know what? The cabinet just can't believe that Singaporeans would leave their TV sets in the comfort of their homes to go up to Mandai to look at a bunch of animals at night. And but eventually it was approved. A paltry sum now compared to gardens at the bay. But obviously that's a different kettle of fish. But when they did actually send me the letter, I had to write back to them and say, well, since you took nearly 3 years to approve the project, we now have a 30% inflation factor, and it's going to cost $72 million. And they said, shove it. And they said, there's no way that we can politically give any more money to the project. And so we said, well, what are we going to do? And they said, well, we'll give you money through other sources. And the Singapore Tourist Promotion Board kindly gave us some money, and so did the Singapore Totalisator Board, to take it up to $65 million, which was enough to get it going. Actually, one of the last parts was never developed, but anyway. Anyway, design and construction took 3 years. It opened in 1994. It was developed on 40 hectares of undulating land. And it started off with 1,000 specimens of about 100 species from Asia, Africa, and South America. There was a raging debate, almost like cabinet's debate, about lighting. And there were two issues. One is the color of the light, and one is where the direction of the light came from. Now, we had a lighting designer, Simon Corder, and he said, it's simple. Let's use the color of moonlight, which is the same color as sunlight, which is actually 5,000 degrees Kelvin. But everybody else said, let's use yellow light, let's use blue lights, and eventually it was 5,000 degrees that was agreed upon. And similarly, he said, let's take the light down, because the moon is up here, so let's take the light down, because many people were suggesting that we have the lights up, and we have searching spotlights. And he said, the moon is there, light should come down. Eventually he won, thank God. He was a outdoor theater designer. He had a very theatrical focus. There was an average lighting level of about 30 lux. We used various types of lights. One was sort of very broad wash lights, and other narrow light beams to spot water holes, wallows, eating areas. And we used warm lights only in shelters and human areas. Then we used high masts so that we get this feeling of moonlight, 8 to 12 meters high. And in the exhibit design, you basically have a greater control over what you see at night. That's the same enclosure at the nighttime, and you don't show, obviously you don't light up the barriers, and so you don't see them. And so they were treated like stage sets. And so that was basically the Night Safari. It was a very challenging project to execute and to build. It took about 8 years of my life, from when it was first sort of conceived to when it was opened. And that's why I grew some gray hairs. But anyway, it's over and it's fine. I want to talk to you a little bit now about splitting. I told you I want to split the group into two. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Singapore systems stifling creativity. And basically we have, Singapore is based on a Confucian system where we have personal and, it's jumping around. We have personal and political morality and conduct. And so this is very Confucian. So we have this Confucian system, and we have we have students who are pro-establishment. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, let me just get out of this. No, it's okay. We have students that are pro-establishment, and government scholarships are based on IQ and EQ, not EQ. And we have this homogenization. I mean, we homogenize our children from when they're really young. We put them in kindergartens, we put them in uniforms, we put them in schools where we put them in uniformed groups, and we take that right through to national service and then right through to civil service, where we again homogenize our civil servants, blue pants, white shirt, gold rimmed glasses type of thing. So there is this homogeny in Singapore, and it's there. We've come a long way though. This was a poster that I used to see when I first came back to Singapore in 1973 in the post office, when I used to go and buy stamps. And as you can see, it's obviously a gangster who has long hair, and they will be attended to last. And because I had hair which did touch my ears and did touch my eyebrows, as I got to the front of the line, I was told, you have to go back to the end of the line until there's nobody left in the post office, and then I'll sell you the stamps. So I used Brill cream after that. This is a cartoon by Eric Koo, and I'll take you through it. Basically, it says, small boy, I want to, cannot. Please, can I go? Cannot. So he's a bit bigger now. I think I want to, no, cannot. Then suddenly, God says, be creative. And he says, cannot. Yeah. And in a way, it sort of summarizes our situation here. It's not our fault. This morning, I was talking to STB, and we were talking about something very similar to this. And a lot of people got very upset when I said, Singaporeans are not creative. We're not creative because we're not allowed to be, because our system stifles us. And that's the way it is. I know it's one of those things. In fact, even Yam Tong Dao said we have good schools, we have good polytechnics and universities. Graduates know how to get things done, but they don't know what to do at roadblocks. And this is a problem that we have. A lot of Singaporeans who have been educated abroad actually find it much easier than locally university children. And even Goh Chok Tong said, Singapore needs a few bohemian artists to do their creative stuff. But there is a social price to creativity, and this is the problem, and this is why we don't have creativity in Singapore. Because creative people tend to be avant-garde, they tend to be anti-establishment, they tend to demand change, and they tend to challenge authority. And these are issues that the government don't really like, because we don't want that to happen. And that's why the crazy horse in Singapore died after 13 months. It was brought in, and Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew was very happy that it was brought in, yet it lasted 13 months before it died. And it died because it was never allowed to publicize itself. There is a lot of difference between nature and nurture. The Chinese-born Chinese, CBC, Chinese-born Chinese, communist, repressed, community-centric. The SBC, Singapore-born Chinese, guided democracy, Confucian, family-centric. And then the ABC, American-born Chinese, like Pamela. Democracy, self-confident, and egocentric. The American-born Chinese is a totally different animal from the China-born Chinese. Same genetic material, but nature versus nurture. But if you want to take homogenization to its extreme, you go to Thailand, because they have a different t-shirt for every day of the week. And I was amazed that actually a lot of people do wear them. I say, well, why are you wearing a yellow t-shirt today? King's Day. It's a King's Day, Monday. It's a King's Day. Amazing. Anyway, let's move on. So how do we generate new ideas and implement change in Singapore? These are some random things I've thrown together. Basically, Tina and I were walking down Thomson Road yesterday. We got very upset because they were cutting down all these magnificent old kaya trees. And it's basically Singapore needs more gardeners. Now, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was the reason why Singapore is a green city today, because he was very concerned about greening. This is him. 1963, he's planting a tree. 2030, he's still planting trees. And that is fantastic. And I suspect that we need more ministers and CEOs. And I was very happy to hear today that the CEO of National Parks Board is gone back to being a forester at least. But for some time, we just had administrators running National Parks Board. They have to be empathetic to vegetation and to trees. And basically, the shade given by one tree is phenomenal. It is so phenomenal. And it is amazing that we don't spend more effort and time trying to preserve the trees instead of just cutting them down. And okay, so our friend last night told us that the reason they're cutting them down at up at Thomson is because it's making way for the new MRT station there. This guy happened to be the former chairman of SMRT, and he said it is criminal that they cut down all those trees along Bukit Timah Canal. They could have tunneled, but too scared to because the tunnel collapsed before. So there go the trees. So this is a very interesting tree. This tree is an acacia in the Nigerian Sahara. It is a lone landmark. It's the only tree within 250 miles. And do you know what happened to it? It was hit by a truck. And they think the driver was drunk, a Nigerian. Anyway, civil servants have come a long way since Howe Yun Chong. I don't know if you remember Howe Yun Chong. Some of you probably do. But he was a minister. He was a civil servant and a minister of defense. I remember having lunch once with Howe Yun Chong and Sir Peter Scott. Sir Peter Scott was a very strong environmentalist, and he was trying to convince Howe Yun Chong that Singapore should ratify CITES, sign CITES and sign the treaty. And Howe Yun Chong had no idea what he was talking about, or else just didn't want to get involved with it, which is a shame. I think civil servants have come a long way. I think people in this audience do understand the environment, the need to change. I'm going to skip that one because we're starting to run out a bit of time. I want to talk to you just a little bit about Breakfast at the Zoo, especially because Pamelia is here. Breakfast at the Zoo was a program that I had. I used to go and knock on doors and ask travel agents, why don't you come to the zoo? And they say, well, there's zoos in every city. There's a zoo, you know. And I said, well, why'd you go to the bird park? They said, because there's only a few bird parks in the world. And anyway, it's got the highest man-made waterfall in the world. I said, okay, fair enough. So I was lamenting to a friend of mine who's Dennis Pyle, who was the director for Australia of STB. And Dennis said, well, why don't you do something unique, you know? So I said, like what? He said, why don't you, he said, you bring out your orangutan, so why don't you bring them out and have a meal or something, have breakfast. He went and talked to Pamelia, the only other person in Singapore Tourist Board who believed in the zoo, that it was a tourist attraction. And so we set up breakfast at the zoo, which actually still goes on today. And it was probably the most successful tourist thing that we ever did. We also set up another thing called the Gourmet Safari, where we took the trams in the night safari and we served a full meal on board, just like the Oriental Express. And we also developed Balinese toilets, which Singapore now is becoming very famous for. And I will skip that one because but I want to just show you this. I want to show you the April Fool's jokes and how we were inspired.
This recently discovered colony of penguins is unlike any other. They don't need to huddle together every winter for protection against the bitter cold, because these little fellas can do something no other penguins can. Isn't that amazing? How do they use this incredible ability? Well, they fly thousands of miles to the rainforests of South America where they spend the winter basking in the tropical sun.
So basically there is a tradition that we had in the zoo with April Fool's jokes. And one of them was, because of the breakfast at the zoo, we put out a story that Ming was putting on too much weight. And so we were going to have an aerobic session with her for breakfast. And you could buy into that. For $50, you could actually have breakfast with Ming and do aerobics. And we had 150 calls to do that. It was fun. Just to close, I would like to invite you to a book launch, which is a book of mine, not mine, it's written by Kirpal Singh. It's called Naked Ape, Naked Boss. It's going to be, the launch will be on Friday at 5 p.m. at the Arts House, which is the old Parliament House. And you are all most welcome to come if you have the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. May I now invite Ms. Yeoh to join Mr. Harrison on stage for the panel discussion and Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, during the Q&A, please state your name and organization before asking questions or making comments. You may raise your hand and our staff will walk to you with the handheld mics. I will now hand the time over to Ms. Yeoh.
So thank you very much. Wasn't that a wonderful talk? So I have about half an hour with Bernard. So thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this lecture. It's such an honor. I've been a great admirer of Bernard for a long, long time, a great fan. So a great privilege. But before we begin, can I just ask you in the room, Bernard, maybe we should find out from them, you know, how many of you have been to the zoo? That's very high, okay. How many of you have been to the bird park? Wow. good customers here. How many of you have been to the night safari? Okay, so this is the telling one. How many of you have been to the river safari? Okay, so you need a few more customers, but that's great. So they're all fans of yours, Bernard. So, so before I get into the points that were raised in your talk, really thought-provocative points, I just want to sort of dial back a little bit, and because I always believe that to talk about the future, we should always talk about the past, you know. And you mentioned him in your talk. It was quite a coincidence because I prepared this, and I said, Confucius said, study the past if you would divine the future, right? And for Singapore, I mean, I think it's been an incredible success story. It's been very successful. And there must have been some creativity in Singapore to have built this incredible success story, right? So what are the lessons do you think Singapore can learn from its past to divine its future?
That's a tough. What? Do I want tea? Okay, I think Singapore happened. Singapore was a chaotic place when I first came here in the 1960s. Hockley bus riots had just finished, and they really didn't look like a very exciting place to be what it is today. We were very fortunate, I think, that we had Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his cabinet who came in and kind of sorted things out. The only problem with that was, of course, that he brought in, and I think rightly so, I'm not trying to be politically correct, but I think rightly so, he put in very draconian laws to sort of sort Singapore out and move it in the economic direction. And they've just kind of stayed, you know. And so I think we have now this managed democracy, which works very well for Singapore. But it's just that when Mr. Goh Chok Tong said, let's be creative, I don't think he understood what he was saying. And you can't. And in fact, the chairman of STB, I was on a select committee with him. That was Wee Yi Chow. He eventually, we were talking about creativity, and he said, Bernard, how long will it take Singapore to become a creative society? Because this is the instructions we got. I said, and I was serious. I was thinking very carefully. I said, Yi Chow, probably about one generation, if we can change the primary school system completely and overhaul the secondary and the tertiary systems and maybe modify national service a bit. And he said, I thought we just needed a creativity campaign.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously, creativity is not like a magic pill that you swallow, because I think in today's world, we all expect instant results to everything, right? I mean, it's the age of instant gratification. But the point that you raised in your talk was circumstances dictate innovation, you said, right? And so probably in the past, circumstances dictated innovation because Singapore had to survive, right? What do you think are the circumstances now in the world that are dictating the need for innovation in Singapore? Why is it so much more important now? Singapore's been going for 48 years. Why is it so much more important now for creativity and innovation to happen in Singapore?
Well, because Singapore is a very small country, very small economy, no hinterland, have to live on our wits.
But that's always been the same, right? That's not changed.
Yes. But it was propelled to be able to do that with the PAP, I suppose, and we've set a benchmark that we just have to keep reinventing ourselves. It's like this morning, the tourist board was asking me, so what do we need to keep coming up with new tourist attractions? And I was saying, and the lady asked, why can't we be like Paris, where you just go there and visit because you like the place? And I said, well, I wouldn't come and visit Singapore if I just liked the place. Maybe once or twice, but I wouldn't go back like I'd go back to Paris. We don't have that kind of attraction, I think.
But is that because just we're so young compared with Paris? You know, I mean, Paris has a lot of history.
Well, it's just, I mean, I think we're just a big shopping center with
Okay.
with a couple of casinos tagged on.
With a couple of national parks, right?
I know, yes, and
Yeah, yeah.
national park.
With a couple of national parks.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I mean, yeah, we do sell the nature bit. We do sell it.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to, now I want to move away the topic and then I'll come back to that, okay? All right. And let's just kind of lay back now and say, okay, let's get into your past. I think it's more interesting, right? Your past, okay. And how did you get into this nature and wildlife business? I mean, was it a call of the wild that you woke up one night and you heard the lions and you go, I got to go out there?
No, I was born into it. I mean,
Okay.
my father was professor of zoology at the University of Singapore. So I was raised in that sort of mold. My brother's a botanist. I'm a zoologist, you know.
So nature, nurture together created you.
I mean, but I think most people who study zoology at university end up as bankers and stuff, you know. but I was very lucky in the sense that I actually got to do what I was trained to do. You know.
Okay, right. So, you know, Mickey Rooney, a wonderful comedian, right? He passed on yesterday. He was 93. He passed on yesterday. And one of the favorite quotes that I've got from him is like, other than what did he say? I was 13 years old for 30 years, you know? So there was this childlike thing to him. But he always says, you always pass failure on the way to success, right? And so how important do you think failure is to building, you know, character and strength in the person? And, you know, for you, what was your biggest failure?
Well, I think it's very important to make mistakes and to be allowed to make mistakes. And in fact, you should make mistakes. You learn. That's the only way you learn. You know, I mean, if a child didn't burn his fingers on a candle, then they would never know anything to do with heat. We made many mistakes at the zoo when we first set up the zoo. I mean, when I joined in 1973. In November, the zoo was set up in June 1973. I joined, and it was a beautiful place, but we were chaos. We were young, we were totally inexperienced. We didn't know very much about keeping animals, zookeeping. We had a panther that was on the loose. It was on the loose for 13 months.
Did you tell us about it?
Yeah, everybody knew. It's like there was a hippo that got into the reservoir for 48 days. How do you catch a hippo? It's like, and then we had an eland, which is a big antelope, jump over a fence, probably because the hippo walked past.
Okay.
And went into the reservoir, into the catchment. And I think at that stage, Lee Kuan Yew wrote a letter to Dr. Ong, my chairman, and he said, the eland is the biggest and fastest antelope in the world. I don't know how you're going to catch it. And Dr. Ong, I think he wanted to commit suicide. He just saw this letter. And it's like, and then 2 weeks later it came back, you know, just walked in.
Yeah.
So we made mistakes.
But, you know, those are mistakes. And I think, would you say then, you know, the decision to bring Crazy Horse, which closed down after 13 months, that was a mistake. But at least they tried, right? At least they tried to do something new.
Well, I mean, I think they tried, but I just don't understand why. Maybe I'm being wrong, but why was it nailed by some elements of the government? Mm-hmm. Because it must have been.
Okay.
It must have been. I don't know. I defer to the audience, but I can't see how Crazy Horse could have failed unless. And it was never publicized, I think. That was one of the biggest problems. It didn't get enough publicity. Because it wasn't allowed to publicize itself.
Okay, but perhaps another school of thought is, you know, I mean, coming back to your point is that why does Singapore always have to build new attractions all the time, right? And then I think what was interesting when you talked about the marine life park that was built, and then it was supposed to be the biggest, and then now China is bigger, and Dubai is going to be bigger, and big is no longer enough, right? You just can't build big, right? So you have to build different.
Yeah.
So what kind of different attractions can Singapore build?
Well, I think Singapore needs to build smart In fact, I've always felt that the casinos were a cop-out. I just thought it was like, you can't think of anything else to do, so just build some casinos.
Easy money, huh?
Yeah, social price. But I think I think there are things that one can develop, and I think there are boutique things that you can develop. And I was talking to Tourist Board this morning about an idea that we have been developing, which is the Anzu, where you go into a place. It's like a national park. Actually, very similar to what Lynn probably first conceived the night safari to be, but this is during the day, where you go into this national park, and there are things that happen, and birds fly over your head, and snakes go across the path. But it's all orchestrated. It's random encounters, but it's orchestrated random encounters. And you could do something very beautiful like that if you took, let's say, a place like Pulau Ubin and had lease of it for 20 or 30 years before somebody came and turned it into a big satellite town. Okay. You could do that.
Okay, so an Anzu concept. So to build smart and to build different. Okay. So let's now talk about innovation, right? And again, circumstances dictate innovation. And one of the things that in my job covering web and travel, which is all about travel technology, is, people always tend to think that innovation equals using technology to solve a problem, right? But maybe it's not, because there is a school of thought that says we tend to over-technologize innovation. And this guy, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the book Anti-Gravity, for example, he talks about how the iPad was basically based on the ancient writing method of the cuneiform. And the tablet computer is actually based on the roots of tablet writing. And he said that basically simplicity was thoughtful reduction. And that quote came to me when you were talking about the moonlight. Mm-hmm. When everybody was trying to be clever, and then the guy just says, well, the moon is shining, we got moonlight, and then let's shine the light down, right? Yeah. So could there be more of this thinking that goes on in Singapore, you think? Or do we overcomplicate issues because we analyze them?
Well, as I say, I really do believe there's a very strong difference between creativity and innovation. I think we're very good at innovating. We know how to take a good idea and bring it to market, which is basically what innovation is. Creativity is very different. Creativity is like you come up with a radically new idea, and you don't think about bringing it to market, because that's the last thing on your mind. You create it, and you're actually amazed that somebody says, well, I'm going to take that and I'm going to make it into something else, which is fantastic. And so creative people are, I think, are very different. And that's why I say that creative people are like, Singapore doesn't have an environment for creative people. We stifle them, because
is that why you live in Bali?
Yes, partly. But we stifle that because they need a certain space. And I think if we want to be a creative society, we need to import creative people to come here and do some brainstorming and then go away. So in other words, we should say, I'm going to hold a brainstorming for this. I'm going to bring in 20 people from who are creative in these particular fields, and then get their ideas, and then send them off and develop the ideas and innovate that.
Okay. But at the same time, I mean, I'm just being a devil's advocate here, because that's my job, right? Do you think it is a very stereotypical image of creativity? This long hair, blue jeans and drugs and rock and roll, and the other word that I cannot use in this audience. So is there a stereotypical notion of creativity that only those people are creative? Because right now in technology, for example, right? I mean, they're saying this is the age of, the old days was Mad Men. Did you all watch the TV series, The Mad Men? one of the best TV series about creativity and advertising. And now it's the age of the math man, the data geeks, the technology geeks, who know how to solve problems using technology and analyzing data. So
I think I think the stereotype of a creative person is obviously is irrelevant. I don't think it has to be that. But I think it's far more important to bring people from diverse backgrounds together who have the ability to free roll in thought, which is the definition I treat of creativity, as opposed to people who can't free roll, and put them into a room and get them to address an issue. And if you want to design something or create something, then bring in 5, 6, 7, 8 people, all from different backgrounds, and get them to brainstorm for 2 or 3 days. And these kind of people are normally attention deficit. They are bouncing off all the walls, and you've got to manage them, you've got to facilitate them.
Yeah.
But they will come up. But it's not any one of them will come up with something. It's a fusion of suddenly, bang!
Something magic happens.
It's not that they in themselves will come up with the ideas. That fusion of that group of people will come up.
Okay, let's ask the room. So if you agree that Singapore system stifles creativity, hands up. Okay. Singapore system does not stifle creativity. The rest, not sure. Okay, so obviously there is a leaning towards the fact that it does stifle creativity. So let's come back to Singapore, since this topic is about the Centre for Liveable Cities, and and Singapore always wants to be a great place to live, work, and play, right? And a great place for both travelers as well as for locals. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being utopia, where do you think Singapore is on the needle? As a great place to live, work, and play. Obviously not for you live, but,
I was interested to see yesterday that some Saville or something had ranked Singapore third with the most X factor. New York, London, and Singapore. That was God, I think.
All right. So third X factor with the sizzle.
It has this X factor about it. But I think Singapore is a very livable place. It's a bit expensive, but it's a very livable city. I mean, I travel to quite a lot of cities in my work, and I'm very happy to come back to Singapore, and then I'm very happy to go back to Bali.
So you have the best of both worlds. Yeah. But how would you define such a place? A great place to live, work, and play. And which place have you been to that you say has gotten this balance right?
A great place to work, live, and play.
Yeah.
I like New York. If I had to live in a city in the States, I'd live in New York or San Francisco.
Okay.
Can't think of many other places now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's talk about what are the things. What's the one thing that Singapore is really, really good at?
I think managing things. We are just so good at managing things. Again, I was talking this morning about the airport and how utterly dull the Singapore airport is. Changi Airport is 3 boxes: Terminal 1, Terminal 2, Terminal 3. And that's it. I mean, there's no other architecture there except some bougainvillea. And yet, KL Airport is so beautifully designed. It's designed by a Japanese architect. It's so beautiful. But if you go into KL Airport and you go into the toilet, the door's going to falling off.
So Singapore works.
Singapore, we're just so good at it. That's why I said we have the first and the best night safari, and we always will have the best night safari because it's in Singapore. So it just works. We're just so good at managing things.
Okay. So what could it get better at?
Creativity.
Okay. And what's the most underestimated tourist attraction of Singapore?
The
most underestimated.
Ooh, I don't know.
Did you say?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe we can have some questions,
Yeah,
some answers from the audience. What do you think is the most underestimated tourist attraction of Singapore? that our tourists don't know about? Because they're always showing the big icons, right? The towers and all that. What do you think, as Singaporeans, as people who live here? What do you think is the most underestimated tourist attraction of Singapore?
Botanical gardens.
The botanical gardens?
Yeah, that's the evolution garden.
MacRitchie Reservoir? Okay. HDB Estates? Sorry?
Haw Villa.
Haw Villa? Okay. Changi Village. So one of the things I attended the yesterday's tourism industry conference. Who was there yesterday? Okay. And they were talking about how, the hygiene factor, Singapore is really good because everything works and all that, but what was missing was that wow factor in terms of delivering a tourist experience, right? And travelers today are looking for local, immersive experiences. So for example, HDB Estates, people are actually really interested in that. So how do you think Singapore can ensure that, its visitors really get these local, immersive experiences beyond visiting the gated attractions?
Well, I mean, set up bed and breakfast, for them, definitely. I think a lot of people would, on both sides, would like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, bed and
Can I
breakfast.
add something?
Sure.
Singapore is meaningful in different ways to different people. And I think this is something we should fundamentally understand. So if you are from an underdeveloped country, you come and you love the modern amenities. But if you come from another developed country, you're looking for more culture.
Yeah.
And this has been that way historically, and we should recognize it and we should deliver it.
Thank you for that. So if we go back to the bed and breakfast idea and all that, actually that sort of goes right into a very interesting trend that's come up in tourism, which I'm sure that you know about, which is the Airbnb model, right? How many of you have stayed in an Airbnb? Quite a few. How many of you have actually rented your space through Airbnb or Travelmob? Through one of those sharing sites. So you have a couple of people who are doing it. So yesterday actually was interesting. I got a press release from Airbnb saying that it's achieved 50,000 nights booked from Singapore alone. Now Airbnb is worth more than Hilton or Hyatt in terms of valuation on the stock market, right? So it's about the sharing economy, like all assets can be monetized, including your room, your house, your skills, your car, your dog. You can monetize all your assets, So what are your thoughts on this, on this sharing economy? And could it sort of enable Singaporeans to create new jobs for themselves, Because maybe we cannot rely on the government anymore to keep creating jobs.
You mean 50,000 room nights were sold last year?
From Singapore alone.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so obviously Singaporeans want that kind of experience,
and
right?
it's going into somebody's house and like having sharing and having breakfast with them.
It's local host, basically.
Yeah. So
it's like local host.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic. It's,
You should put your house up in Bali on Airbnb.
yeah.
There are people who are making lots of money on it,
Oh, no, I think it's amazing. I think that's just actually mind-boggling when I think how I just don't comprehend that. But yeah, sure.
Feedback from those visitors in HDB estates?
I'm sorry?
Is there any feedback from those visitors in B&B estates?
Not in the press release, but I will follow up and ask the question.
What I'd like to know is the response very positive? It meets expectations or it's less than expectations?
Well, according to the press release, okay, the top 5 places that Singaporeans booked Airbnb were Seoul, Paris, London, Tokyo, and Taipei. And the price-wise, Singapore travelers paid an average of $145 per room per night since the first guest booking was made in March 2009. So Airbnb is not necessarily cheaper. It's just that it's different, right?
Experiential.
It's experiential. It's about allowing a traveler to meet with you, a local host.
Right.
So it's an interesting phenomenon, And you were talking about how innovation usually comes from outside, right? Disruptors to the industry. And I guess these are non-travel people who come into the industry to disrupt accommodation.
We go to South Africa almost every year, and we have a bed and breakfast place that we go to. Like every time we go back, we just go back to that place. It's in the middle of nowhere. You've really got to go there, and we just go back because we just love the people. You know?
Okay.
It's very experiential.
So if that's the trend, like travelers like yourself, so you are forsaking, not wanting to stay in hotels and all that, how do you think Singapore can ride onto this trend?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, but I've never heard of anybody doing it. So I guess you should really start developing it as a serious business for HDB flat owners to be able to offer a good experience.
Yeah.
I got a feeling that I wouldn't want to go into some of these HDB flats and rent. I mean, you must have a certain standard.
Yeah, the site allows you to rate the place and rate the host as well, and the host gets to rate you as well, It's like, are you a good guest or not? If not, then you get a bad rating. So anyway, I just found this interesting because this is kind of the new economy that we're moving into, and it creates opportunities for us as individuals. And then I now want to talk about jobs, right? Because I think, Singapore's tourism industry, it has to be dependent on people like ourselves to be willing to work in tourism and look after visitors. And yesterday, I was again at the tourism industry conference, and the STB chief executive, Lionel, said that basically there was an aspiration mismatch between hotel jobs and what Singaporeans wanted. And he said that less than 30% of the jobs in hotels were considered PMET jobs. Do you know what PMET meant? I didn't really know, but it's professionals, managers, executives, and technicians. Right? And yet more than 60% of job seekers in Singapore by 2020 want to have PMET jobs. So there's a mismatch between the jobs that are being created in hospitality versus Singaporean aspirations. How do you think that mismatch can be addressed? I mean, when you were running the zoo, was it difficult to get staff? Was it?
Well, it's not difficult to get staff in a zoo particularly because you get a bunch of oddballs who like to work in zoos.
It's a fun place to work.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like you just get people who just want to work there. They just really do because they love working with animals. So it's normally relatively easy to get as long as you pay reasonable amount of money.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know what's happening with the hotel industries here. I think there's a problem, sir.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is a labor shortage, right? And hotels cannot deliver on the service standards because there are no Singaporeans who want to work the rank and file jobs, right? Yet the prices are rising. So, would you be concerned about, the value for money that travelers would get because prices are rising in Singapore? Rates are high and then people are not able to get that kind of service.
If I was the head of STB, I would be very worried about it. Yeah.
I guess that's why he raised it.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a catch-22, isn't it?
Maybe we can go to question and answer and have a discussion with the audience now. And could we have the microphone? Keep it up, yeah.
Thank you very much. Before I ask my question to Mr. Harrison, I just want to make a comment on what you were saying. Listening to both of you, I think the amount of ideas and innovation and creativity in this room has been bouncing a lot. So, well, if we have trouble finding hospitality staff, then this HDB idea is much better. People are prepared to self-cater for themselves. And you solve that, you market an authentic experience without having to employ a lot of staff, whether foreign or they just go to the local coffee house and eat, and perhaps Singapore should be thinking in an innovative, creative way there, or the tourist industry. But anyway, that is not my question. My question to Mr. Harrison is this. You know, the two of you were debating the difference between innovation and creativity. And I think it became evident from Mr. Harrison's talk that, you know, you can't be creative or show you're creative just by sporting long hair and not wearing a white shirt. That's just the superficial trappings. I just want to throw this idea down, which I think Mr. Harrison is a very good example of, and perhaps because he's a good example, he may not have analyzed it himself. I don't think you can bring up a child to be creative, and this is something that you have to start young. You can't suddenly become creative at 50. You have to lay the foundation young. And you have to lay the foundation by exposing the child to the right environment. And the right environment, I'm doing my marketing here as a former president of Nature Society, the right environment includes exposure to nature, which is why I think that Singapore does create the right environment, but we're not making use of it. Perhaps you might like to comment on that, Mr. Harrison?
No, I agree.
I mean, Mr. Harrison is a good example because he was exposed to nature when he was young. But there are a lot of other people who support this reasoning, from Rachel Carson to Richard Feynman, who's not a nature person, he's a physicist, Nobel Prize winner.
No, I agree. I mean, I think exposure to nature is certainly a very critical thing. That's why I talk a little bit about biophilia, not very much, but we do have this great affinity to nature, and it allows us to be very calm. That's why they use it in hospitals. But unfortunately, a lot of people in Singapore don't get exposed to nature, although we have it around us. Yeah. I mean, we're just confined. I mean, national servicemen die from this soil bacteria, Pseudomonas, because they don't have any resistance to it, because they don't go and play in the sand and in the mud, and we're not exposing our children. When the average Singaporean is not exposing his children to nature.
This is why I think the zoo has a critical role educationally, not just attracting tourists. Of course, tourists also can have an educational experience. I think you can, in a modified way, expose not just children, but everyone to nature in a controlled way in the zoo. This is what I did with my daughter when she was young.
You have school programs, don't you? I mean,
yeah, but in fact, that's another bee in my bonnet about the Singapore Zoo now, is that it's just so expensive for local people to go to visit. It's just crazy. It's too expensive to visit. It's expensive to eat there. It's just an expensive day out. And we should actually be highly subsidizing visits for locals to go to the zoo, to just take their family there, and
okay.
That's just the commercial way that Singapore is going.
Right. Do we have any questions from the audience? The back there.
Hi. Mr. Harrison, John from National Heritage Board. Thank you for your talk, really love it. Can I ask this question, quite a simple one actually. What will you do today if I give you the night safari again and say, well, take it into the next 20 years? What is going to be your vision for the night safari beyond what it is today?
Thank you. Actually, not a great deal more. I would add on some nice new exhibits, but I would actually keep it very much as it is, because I think that there's and I'd renovate some of the existing stuff, and I think it's a bit run down, but that's because it's like a baby. You watch a child grow up, and I would just fine tune it and maintain it so that it's a really good attraction. And that's why I actually always show that video of the fishing cats, because nobody has ever heard of a fishing cat. It's not a mega vertebrate, it's not a big mega star, it's a cat that happens to like water and likes to fish. There are many, many animals like that you can put into a night safari or a zoo that could just create a fantastic experience. And so I would really work on visitor experience, making sure that as much of what is on display is active and doing things, not because the keepers are pushing them with sticks, but because because you've got the right mix of animals who are actually just doing things and people just get fascinated by them. So I just work very hard on the software rather than actually building a lot more hardware, because I think the hardware is just about there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Joanna from Republic Poly. I'll just like to ask Mr. Harrison, is that with Singapore government, we try to take a proactive approach in rejuvenizing the tourism landscapes and attractions, and even putting a lot of resources in terms of money and effort.
Is that what's happening? So
yes,
you said, okay.
That's what's happening in the government sector. But then moving forward, at the Mandai Northwest cluster, where the next Mandai is going to be, do you think the government should be involved in putting a hand in it? Because based on your experience, in terms of how long we take to process the funds and how the government may stifle creativity, do you think the government is the right party to drive this project? And if going forward, what are some of the tips and lessons you want to share with us?
Well, I think, I suppose we're talking about the same thing. I mean, there's a parcel of about 30 hectares of land. I think that's, actually for the last few years, it's been tossing around, not knowing what to do. I think we got involved in a tender about 4 years ago with the land, and didn't come to much. I think that it's important that the government should give some direction to it. I would be scared stiff of allowing the creative forces of the private sector in Singapore to get their hands on that piece of land, chop down all the forest, and So I would make sure that it was steered carefully. And if I was the government, I would actually brainstorm with some very strong parameters, brainstorm some ideas that could be developed there that would play heavily on retaining as much of the natural vegetation as possible, and creating some kind of a complementary eco-attraction, maybe with overnight stays or whatever it is, but some kind of something very complementary to the rest of the wildlife reserves attractions there. But I would steer it. I would steer it quite carefully. Of course, the private sector will have some great ideas, but I would set very strong parameters as to how it could be developed, because otherwise I think it could be a mess.
Okay. Do you have a question then? Mistakes made from it's on the
Sorry?
Do you have a question?
You done? Okay. Hi, I'm Heike Meyer. I am German, and I'm a Singapore PR, and I have lived here for the past 40 years. Mm-hmm. So I know the zoo. My children actually were brought up in the zoo on Sunday mornings, like my grandchildren are today. I would like to comment on the creativity aspect of your talk. Creativity is something that needs a very open mind of the surrounding environment. An open mind can only exist where you have a mature society. We live in a very young country here. When I went to university, it was the heyday of the Red Army faction. On most days, the lectures were closed doors. People were sitting on the floors and on strike because some political agenda was being discussed that led to nowhere. There was absolutely mayhem everywhere.
Sorry, this was in Germany?
In Germany, yes. And I can certainly tell you that this kind of freedom is not exactly enjoyable. So when we came to Singapore in '73 and we observed it throughout all these years, we've always said that in this country, for all the diverse communities that live here, this guided democracy was the only way for it to function. If there had been any other than that, the free democracy that we have in Europe or in the Western world, where we also encounter lots of problems because we are all so super free that we demand freedom on every level in our daily life and in our private life, it would not have worked. Singapore has to grow older, more mature, and creativity needs an open mind, as I said earlier, because whoever is creative is in the first instance uncomfortable. Uncomfortable to the authorities, uncomfortable to the environment and the existing society. So anybody doing something radically new has to break down barriers. And that will always cause pain in some quarters or uncomfortableness. And therefore, creativity is something that has to slowly evolve. No campaign is going to do it. What you suggested, school, change the school curriculum. And again, also there, do it slowly. Anything that is done fast is going to be radical, has no maturity, and has no roots. And for these roots, creative roots, to grow, Singapore would just need more time. That's my impression or observation here.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
But I appreciate whatever is happening here and or my family or my friends, because we see that there are in so many ways river safari, night safari. People are breaking out of that mold, and it's wonderful. Gently, carefully, and on safe ground, I would say. But it is happening, and it will happen more and more so. And when it happens more so, there will also be a lot of uncomfortableness for Singapore.
Right.
That will surely go hand in hand.
Thank you. Thank you. So a change in mindset, open mind, and that it's gonna take time. Maybe, do you want to comment on that? Or?
Just a little bit. And I agree totally what you're saying. And actually, I think what I said actually again this morning is this guy Richard Florida talks about the flight of the creative class and moving out of the traditional areas of creativity, especially California and places, and going to the new centers like New Zealand, Estonia, Ireland, places like that, where they're allowed to be bohemian without being too suppressed and things like that. I think my reaction to the creativity thing in Singapore was that it came down as a directive 10 years, 12 years ago, and it was just, to me, it was a crazy directive. It said, you must be creative. We're going to create a creative society, and it just didn't make any sense to me. You know, that's why I kind of read it.
Okay. One sentence. Okay.
And just to point out that maybe Singapore is on the right track, I read a few days ago in the newspaper that in the PISA study, which has been done internationally in 65 countries, and Germany is also one of them, Singapore came out tops in creativity. So maybe it's problem solving. That's already a huge step forward ahead of countries like Germany and the United States.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, somebody told me about that.
So we're creative in problem solving. So maybe we can, one of the big phenomenons of social media is, the fact that, crowdsourcing is a really, really good thing that's happened, And so maybe we can go to the audience here, and who are the students in this audience? Who are the students? Creativity also means curiosity and, daring to ask questions or putting up your hands. Who are the students in the audience? Anybody?
I'm not a student, but I'm a civil servant.
Okay, maybe what we can do is, I'm going to crowdsource now, some ideas on what Singapore can do to encourage creativity in whatever it is you're doing, whether you're working in your organization or you're working at Polytechnic, you're working in a government department. Just shout one idea that you think Singapore can do to encourage more creativity from you, because all of us have creativity in us. Any ideas?
Limin from CLC. I just said something that I thought was quite interesting in the sense that we did have quite creative ideas in the past. Peter was just sharing with me that we used to train monkeys to clean up the parks, like climb up trees to remove dead leaves. And right now we have a crunch of, not wanting to depend too much on foreign workers to do cleaning, right? And then we also have the other problem of too many monkeys hanging around our parks. Why can't we go back to train monkeys to train up our, to clean our parks again?
Wow.
Or have we forgotten creative solutions that we have had in the past that we might want to revisit?
Okay, right.
I have a
It's
I
called
have a guy.
multitasking. Yeah.
I have a guy that we can hire to do that.
Actually, that's a learn from. One of the ideas could be like learn from animals, right? And one of the talks that was really interesting that Bernard gave a long time ago when I asked him to speak at my conference was, what we can learn from the animal kingdom in terms of leadership or creativity. Maybe you want to share a couple of lessons that we can learn from monkeys or, the creatures.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the 16 million animals on Earth, but just going back to the monkeys for a minute. Actually, it's I think it was Corner that used to get them in the botanical gardens to go up and pluck orchids from tall trees and things like that. And I think there is some interesting potentials there. The only problem with monkeys, of course, is that they do need a lot of training.
Okay. Okay.
We live in the equatorial environment. And
so
most
what-
of the time, equatorial zone, we are in the
alright.
equatorial zone. But most of the time, people write that we're in a tropical country. So what is your take to that? Regarding the HDB, we always want to do natural landscape, but the town council and residents decided that it should be a manicure. And that is very hard to change back. But I believe that MPark is going to set the rule that we should go back to nature. And likewise, HDB and the government is starting to realize that green is good for us.
Well, I mean, that's why I like Kutek Park Hospital so much, because actually when he first, the CEO is a guy called Liak. When he first saw the plans, they were actually manicured gardens, and he managed to change it all to turn it into a tropical rainforest. And I think he just did a brilliant job, and it's so good. And the irony is that actually there's much less maintenance to do than if it was manicured, because you don't have to sweep up anything, you don't have to water. It's kind of a self-perpetuating ecosystem almost. So I think it'd be great. And that's why I said it. I'm so happy that the CEO of NParks is at least back being a forester, which is at least somebody who understands what trees and plants is all about.
I mean, I like your point about what you said about Singapore needing more gardeners. And I was wondering, is that in the curriculum, like in primary school, where you teach kids to be gardeners?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just purely a sort of a love for it. I don't think there's any. Is there anything in the curriculum? I don't know.
I think the community garden in Bloom is doing a great job. There's so much more gardeners now. And also, you didn't answer my question about calling this place equatorial instead of tropical, and you mentioned tropical again.
Well, by definition, the equatorial climate is where it actually rains every afternoon, because the sun heats up the water and it comes back in rain, whereas a tropical has this slightly more seasonal. But other than that, I don't really know what's the difference, because it's like, where do you stop being tropical and where do you stop being equatorial and start being tropical? I'm not sure.
Okay. Do we have a question there?
Just to continue with the query you had about gardening.
Yeah.
Are the citizens allowed to plant anywhere in the public space in Singapore?
You're not asking the right person. I have no idea. I doubt it. because there must be a rule for it.
I have a little garden in my bedroom window. That's all I have. So, Singapore needing more gardeners. I think that's a really interesting thought, and if kids were immersed in the environment where they go and learn to garden.
You know one thing, again, I really do take my hat off to these guys at Kutek Puat. They got all these garden vegetable plots on the tops of the on the tops of the wards, the hospital, and they kind of grow in everything. Every time I go there for lunch, they're eating stuff that came out of the garden, and this is something that they do in other cities. I mean, you have communal gardens where residents can share spaces and grow stuff, and I'm sure that you're probably starting to talk about that. But that would be really great, and that's a sense of community. I think that it really does allow people to get to know each other, work together, and share resources, and I think that's great. Either that or put solar or something, but do something with the tops of all the buildings.
I mean, there is another trend in traveling too, where when we all travel, and the food we eat, we want to eat local, don't we? I mean, we want to know where the food comes from and that whether it's local, and so that could be a trend that Singapore taps into, right? With the provision of local food.
Yeah.
With what the other trend that I've seen, when I go into big office complexes now, are these vertical gardens.
Yeah.
There's a lot of vertical greenery now. I mean, is that a good thing?
I think it's great. I mean, it's in fact, one of my colleagues is developing a lot of vertical gardens. I think it makes a lot more sense than having a huge piece of concrete, especially as long as there's enough light inside the building to grow the gardens. Yeah, I mean there are certain technical problems that need to be addressed, but yeah, once you get it right, you can have fabulous vertical gardens, and you can have them inside and outside, and on slopes.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, there's a hand at the back, last row.
Hi, Wen Shan from CLC. You mentioned earlier about the paradigm shifts, and I noticed that a lot of them were moving towards perhaps a more authentic experience of the zoo, just like Airbnb and all that. And but today there are a lot of people who are sort of, maybe not a lot, but people who are becoming more morally opposed to the whole ideas of zoos. Is there even a creative solution to where like bird watching, you can not have to go into an enclosed area, but managing the animals for our own entertainment, it doesn't really teach us very much about protecting natural habitats. So is there another creative solution around having zoos as entertainment venues, do you think?
I think there's, firstly, I think there's around about 12,000 zoos in the world. And I'm a great protagonist that I think about 90% of them should be shut down. And I think there's some horrible zoos I've visited. And I think most zoos in the world should be shut down. And because it's an animal welfare issue. I think a lot of zoos don't address animal welfare. And if you remember those three categories of zoos I talked about right at the beginning, you've got society-based, you've got society non-profit, you have government, and you have commercial. And you find most of the commercial and the government zoos are the ones that are really bad. The commercial ones because they're subordinate to shareholder profit and don't take care of the animals well. And then you have the government ones, which are normally just badly run. Because they're civil servants, they don't really have any incentive or understanding for the animals. But the point is that a good zoo should display its animals in natural habitats, and I think that's what the mantra has been in Singapore, is that if you're going to have an animal, just just do it properly, create as much of a natural habitat as is feasible in the in captivity. And if it's not feasible, then don't keep it. Don't keep them, because there's lots of animals that you shouldn't be keeping in your particular climate. It's like polar bears. You want to keep polar bears in Singapore? We'll get rid of them.
But in general, though, I mean, you say 90% of the zoos should be shut down, but in general, are visits declining to zoos?
No,
is there a trend?
No, it's actually about, I think for the statistically, of the zoos that are monitored, and there are probably about 4,000 that are actually monitored, about 700 to 800 million people a year visit zoos, which is about 10 to 15% of the population of the world. Mm-hmm. So I think people will visit zoos if there's nothing else to do. I don't think it's a logical thing for them to go to national parks, unless in Singapore. And that's why I made that point about national parks in Singapore. It's the most accessible national parks system in the world because you can get to them. You don't have to go. I mean, have you tried going to Taman Negara in Malaysia or Endau Rompin? It just takes a long time to get there. And when you get there, you don't see anything, So it's challenging.
So Singapore makes it really, really easy for you to spot your animal. Okay. All right, and people don't have time. Do we have any other questions? Wait, let me take a question from the back here first.
Hi, I'm Shannon from an urban planning consultancy firm. I have a curious question, actually. I met Claire for lunch the other day, chairperson for Wildlife Reserve. So she was actually impressed, she was trying to impress upon me, many a time there's always a lot of study trips conducted in overseas attractions like zoos, parks, and all that. Again, it's always falling back on the benchmark system. So she mentioned this case of benchmarking on Hong Kong Ocean Park. Yeah, so this is a curious question, whether you think it's relevant to the case of zoo in Singapore, or is it even a parallel in the first place for benchmarking? Thank you very much.
Sorry, I missed the. What did she say about the benchmarking?
Because we were mentioning about creativity and about promoting creativity. So that's really the antithesis of benchmarking, isn't it? So, but in this current system of ours, there's still a lot of emphasis on benchmarking because that's the way to go. Also, it seems to convince stakeholders how to best move forward with funding. I mean, for the purpose of funding, etc. So, or making money to continue to fund the zoo. So, because of that, a lot of trips are being made overseas to learn, to benchmark with other nature-based attractions. So my question is, for Singapore Zoo, she did mention in particular about benchmarking with Hong Kong Ocean Park, and I was just wondering, from your point of view, it's relevant in the first place.
Right. Well, I think benchmarking is fine. I mean, Singapore government loves benchmarking. It's fine. It's good. It's good to benchmark. And I think it's important to choose high-quality things to benchmark against. So, should choose good zoos. Ocean Park has quite a high standard. It's a pretty much of a marine park. So I suppose you can benchmark the river safari against Ocean Park and the pandas, but that's about it. But I think there's two completely different things, really. One is benchmarking for to make sure that you have a proper standard, an even standard of, let's say, animal welfare. Because I used to be the president of the Southeast Asian Zoo Association, and one of our biggest issues is sort of like an accreditation system where you want zoos to have a minimal standard, and if they can't, then you don't want to allow them into your association, or you want to kick them out, or you want to move for the government to shut them down. So you want them to learn how to do things, and I think that's where the benchmarking comes in, that you want to say, well, you should have at least this minimum standard, and that would be a benchmark, I would say.
Right, thank you very much.
Okay, do we? Okay, sure.
Is it okay to another round of questions?
Sure. I think we still have time, yeah.
Okay, referring to the Gardens by the Bay just now, you highlighted that it's more of architectural excellence compared to sustainability, eco-nature. So what advice do you have for us in terms of Singapore to do it better, to make it more eco or nature-based? Because currently today it seems to be pretty intensive when it comes to energy.
Are you national parks?
No, but I could say that I'm public service.
Ah, okay. Okay, I feel very strongly about Gardens by the Bay. It's one of those things. And I made a special trip to Eden. We went there last year, I think. So have a look at what Eden, I heard about Eden, and I said, let's go there and have a look at it, because this is what Gardens on the Bay was benchmarked against or created from. And when I went to Eden, after going to Gardens by the Bay, I was so struck by two things. One is that it was so inexpensive to construct. And it actually had stories, lots of stories, which maybe Gardens by the Bay haven't started their stories yet. But normally when we designers do, we set the stories in right in the design stage. Gardens doesn't seem to be doing that. But there's lots of recycling stories, there's lots of food stories, there's lots of all sorts of stories from the Eden project. So that combination of the fact that it cost 230 million Singapore dollars versus 1.1 billion, if you believe what the government prints, struck me as saying, why did you spend so much money on this thing? And why did you create all these monstrous trees? And it's a beautiful planning solution to complement the theatres on the bay and Marina Bay Sands, and it balances, and it's visually a beautiful thing. And I think the urban planners felt that that's why that competition should be won by these particular people. I don't think they had any interest in botanical gardens. I don't think that was a criteria, and I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not party to it, and I'm not particularly interested. But it's like I think it was an architectural solution to something that was actually botanical, and that's why it irks me even more, because it took so long for the cabinet to make that decision, and yet it seems that it was so simple to make a Gardens by the Bay decision with a lot more money. And that's what irks me more than anything else. That's why it's a bee in my bonnet.
Yeah, so obviously passionate about it. But Bernard, now that it's been built,
you can always blow it up.
I was going to ask what should be done to tell the story better.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's fine. It's the conservatories is just very expensively constructed. The trees are there. I think Jiki's having big time keeping the vegetation alive. Jiki's one of the main contractors who we know very well. But it's there. It's fine. It's very beautiful. I mean, don't get me wrong. Architecturally, it's great, and it's a nice place, and it's expensive to get in. It's $20 to get in, whereas Botanical Gardens is for free. But apart from all that, and I'm sure the restaurant is very nice.
Okay,
but I would just keep running it. I mean, I've got no choice. It costs $34 million to keep the two houses cool, isn't it? That's what I read.
Okay, let's take two more questions. There's one here.
Yeah, Mr. Harrison, you mentioned earlier when you first built Night Safari, there was like a shortfall of funds, like between 72 million and 65 million, and there was a part that was not built.
Mm-hmm. West Loop.
Will you be able to share a bit more, and were you able to actually materialize that in other projects that you have undertaken?
Well, there was meant to be two lodges, one on the East Loop, one on the West Loop, and so you could actually make two stops as you took the tram around. West Lodge was not built, and there was a short-circuiting of the route by about almost a kilometre, because we just couldn't afford to build the infrastructure, although all the electricity, water, sewage was all put in, because and the road was put in, but it was actually short-circuited. So it's there, and I talk with the guys often, and they've been talking about developing the rest of the West Loop at some stage. Bits of it have been done. I would be very surprised if they actually built a second lodge, because operationally it is very complicated to have stops. If you talk with theme park people, they will say don't have any stops at all on a ride and make the ride as short as possible, 5 minutes preferably. This night safari ride is about 30 minutes. And as soon as you allow people off, that means they've also got to get back on. And if it's a crowded night, they can't get a seat, everybody gets upset. So that's why they don't like to stop. That's why probably they would never have a second stop anyway. But apart from that, I think it's doing fine. Oh, the other thing that I was told by one of my ex-colleagues there is that he's just about to retire. And when he retires, he's the custodian of the night safari concept. When he retires, they will open the night safari at 5:30. 5:30 instead of 7:30, because they will bow down to marketing's request to have more volume through the night safari, which totally screws up the whole concept of allowing people to come in for a very nighttime experience. But that's Singapore, you know, man. I mean, we've got to talk about money. They're only making $18 million net profit after tax, and they want to make more. Maybe they've got to pay off the river safari, I don't know.
Okay, one more question. You wanted to make a final comment? Can I have a microphone over there?
Actually, yeah, I wanted to thank you for one of the mistakes that you made. You know, you talked about the Black Panther that escaped. It was one of the highlights of my childhood to track where the Black Panther footprints could be found. And I thought that this idea of really working up the imagination of children by stories about animals seemed to be lacking, or at least you know, this things that capture the imagination of children. So, you know, could we bring that back besides letting out the Black Panther?
Well, we can get some more panthers in.
You can lose more animals and put out alerts out there. So you can do it. You can do it with wild boar. I mean, just spot the wild boar. So we're gonna have to wrap up, because I think it's been a wonderful session. So I just want to ask one last question of you. And I was really intrigued by your book, because I didn't know that you were writing a book.
It's not me, it's Kapal.
Yeah, but it's about you.
It's biographical.
Yeah, Naked Ape, Naked Boss. Okay, so we want you to be naked today in front of us and give us a sneak preview. Give us a summary of the book. What do you want to achieve with this book? What's the story that you want to tell in that book?
Oh, it's purely a biographical story. It's the story. It goes from when I was born to, well, not when I died. Now. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. She's good.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I'm going to compare that whole session about the book. Now, the book was a very interesting read. When I read it, I laughed like mad. It takes a lot to get me to laugh. So it's very funny. Kirpal has written it in a very funny way. If you want to understand more about Bernard, what makes him tick, his formative years, right through to how he became CEO of Wildlife Reserve Singapore, and why in the darners did he resign with the largest publicity campaign, you have to read the book. It also gives a look into Bernard the lover, Bernard the father, Bernard the mentor. So it's all-encompassing in that respect. So get your asses down, come on Friday, and partake of that whole event. But I think in closing, something which was racing through my mind, this is Centre for Liveable Cities. And I think when you take that, I don't really know what it means, but what dawns on me is the aspect of responsibility. What is a livable city? Is it a place that we all live in? So therefore, we have huge responsibilities towards the sustainability of a city. But yet, at the same time, we are so ready to concrete what is green. We are so ready to cut down what is a tree that's been there for 10, 20, 15 years. We're so ready to keep our children inside rather than let them out. So the question is, what sort of livable city would the young Singaporean be conditioned to accept? And the question is, how do we all make that difference? And it's about our attunement towards responsibility. And I think we are making huge sacrifices. We're not greening. We're no longer a garden city. We're a city within an ornamental garden. And that's becoming very, very sad.
Thank you. Thank you for those closing words. So please join me in thanking Bernard. Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison and Ms. Yeoh, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. We would now like to invite Mr. Koo, Executive Director of CLC, to join the panel on stage for photo taking. Mr. Koo, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our lecture. We thank you for your participation and do stay tuned to CLC mailers and the website for information on our upcoming events. We will also be seeking feedback via email and would greatly appreciate it if you could take a minute to help us improve the lecture series. Have a good evening and we hope to see you again.